Had to switch the intro up just to show you there's a mellower side of me. That is called mandolin intro. Me and my wife just went and saw a great North Carolina band called Mandolin Orange, and that is just to drive down or put down the adrenaline just a little bit as an intro to today's topic. Hi there, Vern here, and welcome back to Pastors on Porn. And we are continuing to talk about the three legs of our pastoral role: pastoring, communicating, and leadership. And more in particular, about how unaddressed addictive struggles in our life will undercut our effectiveness in significant ways in each of these three areas. And first of all, you could say, well, am I just is this all about making you feel bad or, heaping shame and guilt on you? Trust me, that is not why I'm doing this. What I am trying to do is open our eyes to see how these things, especially when they're unaddressed, they affect us in ways that we may not have anticipated. We are thinking and going, you know what, I'm doing okay holding all this together and this doesn't really affect me. But as we walk through each of these three areas, hopefully you begin to see, oh my goodness, this really does change and affect the tenor in how I pastor and my effectiveness as a pastor. Let me just say that even if you're not a pastor, and I know I've heard from a number of you who aren't, pastoring and still listen to these podcasts, I think what we're talking about here, it's fairly easy to draw a line into, whatever you do in your life, draw a line into how these areas, when they're unaddressed, how they limit your effectiveness in your life, in your family, in your profession. So again, these are not just to be limited if you're a pastor. I think you could find applications in any of these sorts of areas. And so last week we spoke about people skills and pastoring, and I mentioned that pastors who struggle with porn, especially when it's unaddressed, are often unhappy people and will often be experienced by others that way as well. Irritable, unhappy, unsettled, because they're really unhappy about themselves. And I spoke about how they, when we're in this situation as pastors, how we do need to live in denial and how we are prey to the isolation which accompanies the secret life. And then I ended speaking about kind of the growing frustration that pastors experience in their professional life as the gap continues to grow between attempting to help others while at the same time their own real needs are not being met. And so those were some of the ways as we try to help people with our people skills and help pastor and counsel and work with people, we really are handicapped if we're not able to grow and come out of some of these struggles ourselves. And today I want to turn to the whole area of our public communication. And I think anyone in today's church knows that the role of being an effective public communicator is absolutely key. It's one of the key skills or tools that we need to employ. And let me just say a few comments. You may not have thought about all of these, how I think when we're really secretly dealing with unaddressed issues like porn or addictive struggles, how it tends to play itself out in our preaching and teaching. And I think pastors on porn tend to fall into one of two extremes. The first one, let me just say this, I think there is a bleeding off of your emotions that happen perhaps more than you might realize in your preaching. Last week I said, it would be interesting, if you're going to get an honest answer from your wife or your kids, how a bad day at the office feels to them. If you're honest about it, I think they would say, when you've had a bad day at the office or a bad day online, I think you come home and it does affect the emotions you have towards your family and your kids and the way that others are experiencing you. Now, let me just take that one level further. do you think it's possible that your anger or frustration or irritability could ever bleed into your preaching? Just saying. Maybe you want to ask a really trusted person, do you ever hear in what I'm saying anger or frustration or irritability in my preaching? Scriptures tell us, anger does not accomplish the righteousness that God looks for in our lives. And we would also probably say that anger or these things probably don't make us effective preachers either. I mean, sure, we can call it the fire of God, but more likely it's just our unprocessed emotions, that are being exacerbated out of our unmanaged life. And so I just think to start this thing, we need to be honest with how our emotions bleed way more into our preaching than we might realize. And if those emotions are unprocessed and unfiltered and undealt with, it really does handicap and limit our effectiveness. Let me go back to these two extremes I talked about that we can fall into. The first one is there can be an overemphasis on sin or sexual struggles or lust of the flesh or other things that we go off about in our preaching. I'm not sure if it was the 80s, probably the 80s, or maybe it was the early 90s, when we had the televangelist scandals, when we discovered that some of the household names of TV preachers, had secret sexual lives and, involving prostitutes and things that they were acting out with. And I remember, how the, TV stations or articles love to point out just how zealously these same guys would preach against the lust of the flesh. And, you listen to some of these sermons that preceded these guys acting out, and then knowing they were acting out at the same time, and you go, gee, I wonder who you really were preaching to. Was this just, a giant way of projection or diversion? And I don't know if you've ever listened to someone and wonder, are you preaching to us or are you really preaching to yourself? And sometimes when, we're just preaching against something all the time, it's like we're trying to keep it out there when it really is living under our bed. And, the problem is the more the gap widens between the real state of our lives and our preaching, that dual reality over time, it just hollows us out. And where the only way that we can really survive is to go through the motions. And just going through the motions as a preacher is not a real recipe for God using us to affect life change. So the first extreme is really where we're just hammering and railing on something, but really it's because we find that thing really is something that we don't have victory over, or we think preaching against it almost bolsters our own resolve in our life. So that's the first one. The second one is when let's say the area of sexuality or porn or temptations, it becomes a no-go zone for us in our preaching. You don't preach on a topic when you need to or when it comes up in your preaching schedule, and the reason is because you just don't want to talk about it because you feel bad about it yourselves. Now, you don't want to make the first error, of course, because that whole idea of preaching against something when you're really living it. It sounds like one of those hypocritical Pharisees. And, you don't want to be subject to that verse in James, that says those of us who preach will be judged more strictly. So you avoid going there like the plague thinking, well, I'm going to protect myself from that kind of judgment. And the problem, of course, is that your preaching doesn't cover real life issues and real life struggles for people. And as a result, you don't help people find the hope and freedom in your preaching because you haven't found it yourself. And that gap is just something you would prefer not to talk about at all. I mean, the last area where I think this can affect our preaching is what we could call shiny preaching or inauthentic preaching. And, shiny preaching is for those in shiny churches where every problem is boiled down to simplistic how-to steps to achieve victory. And where you end up really not talking about how some of these problems are incredibly difficult and a struggle for people to deal with in their lives. The problem is, and the insidiousness of it, I think, is that when you give people a false impression of what it really is like to struggle in your life. The scriptures talk about in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. And there is an incredible desperation in that verse. And I think that we can skim over just the difficulties of living life and give people the impression, is just follow these 3 steps, take these 2 pills. It could be that, or maybe it's some sort of version of a triumphalist approach to theology that kind of bulldozes our way through any of life challenges with some sort of simple theological answer that says, well, we're new creations, or we're victorious in Jesus, and hides the difficulties, the limps and struggles from people. You know, here's where I think it starts, is when we begin to hide our limps and struggles from people. It's we can fake it. I've heard people say, and there's people that I know that have lost their entire ministry, and one of the comments that were made is, well, they were so honest and so vulnerable. Yeah, but in our storytelling, even the fun little antidotes that we can give in our sermons, it always ends up, when you really examine them, presenting our stories in the best light. And they're not really, they're authentic to a degree, but they only go so deep. It's like the person at the job interview when they're asked, so what's your biggest weakness? And they respond, well, I tend to try too hard, that kind of thing. But I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about vomiting on everybody, but I am talking about sharing. It's not easy to follow Jesus. There is real deep, desperate struggles in this life. I was so struck by the quote from the late John Wimber, who said, "Don't trust any leader who doesn't have a limp." Now, I'm sure this was John Wimber who told the story. I remember listening to a tape of his once, and he describes as a pastor in a church, and he ended up, not that any of you have ever done this, picking up a Playboy on the magazine rack, and he was kind of thumbing through it, and somebody came to him and said, "Hey, aren't you John Wimber?" And he had the magazine in his hands, and he was like, "I try to be." Another story he told was their church was going through this week of prayer and fasting, and he was out of town, and his wife had called him and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And he sheepishly told her, "Well, I'm here at McDonald's having a Big Mac." And again, you might say, yeah, something about those stories to say, you know what, there is humanity in us. This is not easy. These struggles are besetting sins, and with the grace of God and support of others, we can find lasting freedom. But this life is not easy. And in my preaching and in my conversations with people, I'll say to them, so what is your biggest area of struggle that causes you to get up in the morning and go, God, oh God, oh God, if I don't have you today in my life, I don't think I'm going to make it. Is it a child who's struggling with drug addiction, or teenage rebellion, or a marriage which is always, you feel like, is on its last legs? Is it a child that has a disability? Is it a horrible boss? Is it a mental illness? Is it an eating disorder? Is it an addiction? It's something that causes you to have to engage with the empowering grace of God. That's the kind of preaching that changes lives. But if you are caught and stuck in your hiddenness, you can't go there. And I think the damage of that sort of false presentation of the gospel, that shiny approach to the gospel, communicates to us and to the listeners that God's grace and favor is only found when we have conquered all of our demons and hit this amazing place of spiritual momentum that leaves, the listeners feeling short and that they can't measure up. I think a real grace laden message is this: how our brokenness is in fact the landing strip for the grace, love, mercy, and healing of God, who lands into our world and changes our lives. But it's hard and it's a struggle. And I think that's the kind of preaching and that's the kind of communication that as we lean into God's goodness and God's grace and we lean into authentic relationships, that we can begin to touch and walk into. And that is my greatest prayer, that you would do that as well. Let me just say again, if you haven't checked the website out, it's bandofbrothers.care, and my email is bandofbrothers@shaw.ca. I'd love to connect with you. I'd love to hear more about your story. If you're a pastor, how can we find a safe, healing place for you to engage with God and find His healing in your life? So God bless you. And next week, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about your leadership and how that plays out, especially in a place when you have some of the deep struggles in your life.